Good morning and welcome to my garden. One of the main features of my garden is the fact that I'm growing my own mulch. I'm growing chop and drop. I'm trying to do it Syntropics style, where I grow the mulch right beside the plants that I want to keep. So this is contour 1 on the east. You can see I've got lemongrass and arrowroot here. When I started the garden, that was all the mulch that I had in this garden, and I planted it at the end of every bed. Arrowroot has a very high moisture content, and it's easy to chop, and it's great to lay down in chop and drop rows. And I put many loads of arrowroot down here, and as you can see, it just composts down beautifully. It covers a lot of ground, so that keeps the weeds out. Along this row, I planted a selection of Australian native plants. I also planted elderberry and pigeon pea. As you can see, the pigeon pea is the fastest grower and produces a huge amount of biomass. I've cut this 3 times already this year, and it keeps growing and it keeps producing. Contour 2 on the east originally had a cover crop, a mixed seed cover crop. The primary form of chop and drop I've used here is arrowroot and sugarcane from my Windbreak row, and also bananas. Now, I intended to grow bananas here for the fruit originally, but when I put my grape trellis here, I realised that the bananas growing tall and potentially falling over would damage my trellis. And so I'm going to move my productive bananas elsewhere, but the bananas along here are now being grown purely for chop and drop. And so they produce a good amount of biomass along here. As they get established, of course, the clumps will get bigger and I'll be able to chop them more often. This clump is actually not a dwarf banana clump, so I'm intending to remove that clump completely and replace it with dwarf bananas. Along the Windbreak row here, I've used mainly grass clippings, arrowroot and sugarcane. So when you use the plants for chop and drop that are growing in the row, it reduces the need to transport the mulch. It reduces the risk of weeds and unwanted things coming in the mulch from other sources. And that's what I really appreciate about chop and drop, that it's close and that I'm not getting anyone else's problems. I've started planting arrowroot down here so I can use that for chop and drop. I've planted arrowroot between my mangoes, and you can see it coming up along here. That will quickly grow and form a great source of chop and drop right here. And then I can fill in this gap along the whole row here so that the weeds can't grow between the trees. Before I had arrowroot down here, I was using what I had close by. I used this poinciana tree as chop and drop when I first planted the mangoes. I chopped the branches down, put the thick stems down first, and then the leaves on top of that. I also made use of this weed we have growing here. This is wild tobacco, and wild tobacco has broad leaves and thick stems, and it made great chop and drop. It also grows back really quickly, so by the time I got around to plant the next tree, there was a lot more biomass for me to take right from here. When the arrowroot gets established here, I'll take these poinciana trees out so that they don't shade the mangoes and so that I've got a nice straight row here. Contour 1 in the middle began with a row of cover crop along the front, and once it started to flower, I chopped it down and I dropped it along the back of the row along here. I've also got a lovely plantation of arrowroot and vetiver along here. Turns out the vetiver is a very good idea. While we wait for this retainer wall to be built, it's helping to hold the ground in place. I place my prunings on the chop and drop row as well. Contour 1 on the north has been designed to have the vegetables growing on the northern side and the chop and drop on the southern side. That is so that the northern winter sun can get to the vegetables without the chop and drop blocking all the sunlight. So we've got pigeon pea here. Once again, that's a great producer of biomass. The other plants I've got here are natives. Kings Park Special callistemon is growing well. When I last pruned the chop and drop on this bed, I chopped it all down to knee height, as I do, and I just tip pruned the callistemon. Now you can see how much biomass the pigeon pea has produced, and the callistemon not so much. There are clearly some plants that are more useful for chop and drop than others. I think for me, the pigeon pea and arrowroot have proven to be the most useful. Don't you love the lemongrass all gone to seed? I think it's lovely. It's a nuisance on the pathways. And when hubby does his beautiful mowing job, he now has to dodge the leaves. But I think it's really beautiful. Contour 2 on the north. This chop and drop row was planted with all sorts of plants. Some natives, some ornamentals. And so some of them are pretty, but they're clearly not big enough to produce a lot of chop and drop. I've now got some yacon here. The basils and the salvias I've planted along here will be great for the insects, but they're not going to produce so much biomass. But that's okay. This side of the garden, I'm happy to allow it to become a jungle. The pigeon pea has served me well along here in the spaces where the other plants that I chose to plant didn't grow well. And so it causes me to think that maybe I need to rethink my plant choice. Maybe I need to trial some other plants. Clearly some of them are not going to work for biomass. This arrowroot popped up here after I dropped some of my chop and drop along this row. You've got to watch that with arrowroot. If you don't want it to grow there, make sure you take off the roots of the plant when you drop the leaves. Otherwise, it's very effective at just growing wherever it wants. Again, pigeon pea and arrowroot, more salvia, more basil. The comfrey is spreading quite nicely. I think I only planted one plant, but there appears to be 2 here. I'm going to allow that to spread a little bit in the chop and drop row. More basil, a volunteer tomato plant. This stage, I rather to plant shrubby things like the pigeon pea because they can produce a lot of biomass. Contour 3 on the north. This had a cover crop on it, which I have never chopped. The cover crop wasn't very successful because I planted it when it was very dry and a lot of it did die out. But this pea plant did take over and grow a lot. Now, the result of this not being maintained is that it's smothering this tuckeroo here, which should produce a lot of biomass for me. And it's also growing over and it's challenging the fig plant that I have here, and there's another one down to the centre. It's also joining up with this poinciana tree at the top. The result of that is my potatoes are being shaded. It should be a priority for me to take down this poinciana height and take down this cover crop. The spiders certainly love my chop and drop row. So we've got some grasses growing here in this chop and drop row because I haven't got to it yet. We're preparing for 5 weeks away, and so I'm doing things that really have to be done before I go. And in reality, this garden will be much the same when I get back, just a few more weeds. So this pigeon pea is huge. That would be 3 meters tall. I let it grow initially because I wanted the seeds for planting elsewhere. But I'm concerned now that I'm going to create quite a problem for myself with all these seeds coming to maturity. And then when I drop it on the chop and drop row, these seeds just might germinate. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. Now, when I first came here, I didn't have pigeon pea seeds. I didn't have a lot of the things I use now for chop and drop. And so I was using trees from around the property for chop and drop. This tuckeroo here has been chopped and dropped probably twice. Initially, I cut it in 2 places. I cut all the side stems off at about knee height so that it would sprout around that height. But I also cut it at head height so that it would sprout on top as well. So that tuckeroo has provided mulch for me. Every time I've pruned down the branches of these poincianas, they've gone on the row as well. You can see that on top of this row, as it was the last thing I put down when I pruned down that poinciana. You'll see down the front of the property I have a lot of trees in the front gully. All the weed species that were growing down there became chop and drop for me. And so I dragged them up the hill and laid them on the row. The important part about chop and drop is that you've actually got something to put there. Put down the thick branches first so that they don't carbonise and become hard and brittle. You actually want them to stay moist and be in contact with the ground so that they can rot. However, sometimes I do put the thicker branches on top because of when they come in the pile. That's okay, they'll be covered next time. They'll eventually go in the ground. I really value having plants that I can use as mulch. I value not having to bring mulch from other places. So aside from my once a year bringing in a load of horse manure, mushroom compost to prepare a bed for my potatoes, I don't actually bring in any compost from anywhere else. I'd be interested to find out what other people are using to create mulch for themselves, so they don't need to buy in mulch. The other great thing about having your own chop and drop, having your own mulch growing here, is it's such a beautiful environment to walk along, especially when the paths have been mowed.